We don't accept students from there.
Yeah, that's right. You probably should answer. We're a great school. I was a math major there. That's how I first came to be acquainted with North Carolina. I was set up to be a consultant. Really, I was set up to go the Deloitte, Ernst & Young route. Maybe be made partner or something, and go in that direction for a while. But then I got wind of the Harvard discrimination case. I'm sure all of you here are familiar with the Harvard discrimination case. If you aren't, go back, get a legal education on that. I started getting involved in 2018. The Harvard discrimination case really started to come around in 2018. That was when the First District Court of Boston, Massachusetts released the data surrounding the discrimination that exists in the college admissions at Harvard and UNC. So just to give you a little bit about the data that was released, according to the filings, Asians had to score approximately 270 points higher on the SATs to have the same chance of admission as a black student, and about 50 points higher to have the same chance of admission as a white student. Significant differences across all categories at the Harvard and UNC level. At the UNC level, it was slightly smaller. It was 200 points on the SAT, but still pretty significant. And during this case, Harvard and UNC continuously denied discrimination against Asians. They continuously denied discrimination against Asians. Now you might think, how could this be possible? How can Harvard say that we're not discriminating against Asians when the preferences in these admissions categories based on the over 10,000 admissions received are so high? Clearly there is preferential treatment going on here, and yet Harvard denies it. Well, they have this built-in sort of fail-safe in the admissions process. And this fail-safe, they typically grade applicants on three different things. Academics, extracurriculars, and personality. So in the grades and extracurriculars department, Asians have the highest scores, highest grades out of any racial category, bar none. Extracurriculars, Asians have the highest scores in the extracurricular category. So to make up for it, Harvard rated Asians lowest out of all of the races on the personality metric. So the personality metric measures something called likability, humor, charisma, leadership, kindness, all of those kinds of things. So Asians were the lowest on likability, charisma, humor, kindness, being fun, I guess. Being a Harvard man, a Harvard person, Asians were the lowest on this whole quality, which I guess what you would be the Harvard law student as described in the TV series Suits. Asians were somehow less likely to be this kind of personality as described by the admissions officers. Now you might say, well, now as a law student, right, your objective is to interrogate this and even to maybe possibly take this argument and extend it a little bit. Is it true that Asians are lowest in general on the likability personality metrics? And the objective data shows Asians scored the highest out of all the races on teacher recommendations. They scored the highest out of all of the races on alumni recommendations. They scored second highest in counselor recommendations, so I guess it's the counselors. They scored highest in peer-reviewed recommendations. And unless there's something in the personal essay which wasn't necessarily objectively measured, unless there's something in the personal essay that Asians really scored really low on, there really isn't an objective justification to model what Asians got on the personality score. So the Students for Fair Admissions group, which I serve on the board of, I actually started serving on the board of Students for Fair Admissions in 2021. Before that, I was just an independent journalist. And I still am an independent journalist. Just because you're on the board of something doesn't mean you're wedded to them. It's not like I get paid by them or anything to do this work. This is free work that I do for them. before the Students for Fair Admissions plaintiffs in this Supreme Court case argued that the personality justification, the personality score that Harvard uses to assess measures of likability, fun, humor, those kinds of things, leadership, what it means to be a Harvard man, is actually a discriminatory marker against Asian Americans. That's what Students for Fair Admissions argued. We actually brought in an expert from Duke University, Peter Sidiakono, who was recently interviewed on the Jordan B. Peterson podcast, which you can find recently, and you should hear all of his econometric statistical ways in which he arrived at the conclusion, based on the evidence, that this personality score cannot measure anything objective about an Asian's personality consistent with what has already been placed based on the Students for Fair Admissions data. And Harvard comes in with their own economist. His name is David Card. So you have, in the Supreme Court case, you have did, and they use the personality score against Asian Americans. And so the Grutter v. Bollinger decision created a regime that I would frankly say is racist and stereotypical against Asian Americans. Basically using the fact that Asian Americans are typically, more introverted, maybe they're more agreeable, easy to get along with, maybe you don't necessarily find them, playing high school quarterback all the time, but they use that as a personality metric and they use that stereotype against them in the admissions process. Even though you and I know that there are many kinds of leaders. Not everybody has to be extremely outspoken and charismatic like myself. And not everybody, should be mistreated that way. That's the idea. So that was our argument at the Supreme Court level. Actually, that was my argument at the Supreme Court level. Students for Fair Admissions, which is run kind of by a bunch of libertarian and conservative white guys, they made it more technical, which is fine. It's fine. But my argument at the Supreme Court level was, in essence, the Grutter v. Bollinger regime creates a stereotyping system that still is a violation of the 14th Amendment, of the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, which basically says you shall not strip anybody of the rights and responsibilities of citizenship solely on account of their ancestry, and has been reaffirmed and affirmed multiple times. Slaughterhouse cases, Hibayashi versus United States, that this amendment does not simply apply just to Black Americans, but to Americans of every ancestry and of every race. And in a nation in which the designation of race is increasingly beyond Black and white, we need a robust justification we need this robust view of the 14th Amendment of the Constitution. We just do. Because if it were just about repairing harm and reparative harm to Blacks in this nation, then as the nation becomes increasingly more Hispanic and increasingly more Asian, these minorities are going to be left out of the current regime and are going to be treated the same way that white Americans are in that regime, which is as a privileged class, even though there's no justification to treat these immigrant minorities as the privileged class. Now, I would go even further, and this is a different debate, and maybe some of you will ask me this question, and say, I don't think there's any justification to treat whites as a privileged class. But certainly there's no justification to treat Asians in the United States as a privileged class, which I define privilege as a class that you can take away things from, take away rights from, to repair other people's rights. So we made that argument at the Supreme Court level. No, sir, I'm going to revise that. We did not make that argument at the Supreme Court level. But I think the best argument that we made at the Supreme Court level was we challenged Harvard's diversity justification. So in any sort of strict scrutiny case, which is a strict scrutiny case, Harvard had to prove that their regime was the best regime, there's a compelling governmental interest towards denying Asians the right to get into the universities based on merit, and that their system is the most narrowly tailored way of denying Asians the right to admissions for the sake of diversity. And Harvard's linchpin, and UNC's linchpin as well, was the diversity justification. So they argued that a diverse student body is critical towards maintaining a well-rounded college student body. Now, there are several issues that I have with this argument. The first one is, why are you looking at race as a proxy for diversity? 71% of Harvard's black student population comes from upper, middle class, and higher backgrounds. Okay? They have more in common, or they have plenty in common with the rich upper class elites who are also white in our country. In fact, if you put in legacy admissions at Harvard actually tends to benefit blacks. People don't know that, but it actually does, because there are enough black legacies at Harvard now that it would make it easier for blacks to get in. But these are not poor working class blacks. These are private school educated blacks who come from well-to-do, wealthy, well-off families. So really the diversity justification, you're really using race as a very poor proxy for the kind of diversity that you want to achieve. And then my second argument against this diversity regime is, I get it. I get that you may think diversity is important, but it's not the most important thing for a university. The most important thing for an elite university has to be that it trains elite students. We spend $500 million a year funding Harvard, funding MIT, funding Stanford as a federal government expenditure. And I don't think we do that to help the lower class and underprivileged succeed. Because we could have spent that money in a lot better ways if we wanted that. I think we do that because we as a country have made a social contract and decided that we think that these Ivy League universities are producing the top talent that are going to carry our nation to become stronger. And so when you have admissions policies that curtail that and deny certain people rights, but also deny the most meritorious applicant based on the current measures of meritoriousness, then you're cutting against that. You're cutting in against the true government rationale for why we should have an elite education system, which is to train elite people. So I used to live in Princeton, New Jersey, and there's this, you talk about elite, right? There's this Institute of Advanced Studies in Princeton University, which is not actually owned by the university, but it's its own separate institute that is even more elite than Princeton University. So you think of Princeton University as an elite institution. Think about the Institute of Advanced Studies that is even more elite than Princeton. This is where Oppenheimer researched. This is where Einstein researched. And it's basically funded as basically a man cave, maybe a woman cave, for the nation's most intellectually meritorious individuals to basically study for the rest of their lives. Once you get one of these fellowships, you can study there for the rest of your life. You don't ever have to worry about food or anything like that. And so we believe that that space is the best way to cultivate our nation's most talented people. And if you believe that, then that's great, but don't undermine that idea. So those two justifications worked in the Supreme Court. And in June of 2023, Students for Fair Admissions won the Harvard and UNC cases. And that is the story of the UNC and Harvard admissions cases, told as succinctly as I could. Case lasted 8 years, started in 2014. By the way, we totally bankrupted ourselves as an organization. We're totally out of money. We don't have a $50 billion endowment like Harvard does. And by the way, Harvard spent 12 times as much money as we did justifying their discrimination against Asians. They spent over $100 million on this case. You could build a building with $100 million. And we spent $8 million. And we're totally out of money. And so, I'll tell you what I learned from this case, from writing my books, from working on the Harvard case. I'll tell you what I learned. We should not give institutional deference just because they claim that they're serving the higher moral order. You want to say we shouldn't give churches institutional deference because they claim to serve the higher moral order. That's fine. But don't think that just because higher education institutions say that they value diversity, equity, and inclusion, that they're really going about it the right way, or that we should just defer to them. This Supreme Court case was the first case in which a U.S. Supreme Court decided that they were not going to defer to Harvard's opinion. Every other Supreme Court case in which affirmative action was challenged, or higher admissions, or race in higher admissions was challenged, Harvard came out with the same freaking justification. And I don't know which lobbyist they were using or which person they sent to Anthony Kennedy's house or whatever, but he bought it. And he bought it in issuing Grutter v. Bollinger, saying you could use race-conscious admissions for diversity. And he bought it in Fisher versus University of Texas, which said you could use race-conscious admissions in the university. This is the first time that Mr. Obergefell was out of the case, and the Supreme Court struck down Harvard's race-based admissions 6-3. But I'm here, there's another part of what I learned in this case, though. And I wanted to share this with you because you guys are young law students, and you're going to see this trend more and more and more. I don't want you just to read the majority opinion of the Harvard case issued by John Roberts. I want you to read the dissenting opinions. I want you to read Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson and Justice Sonia Sotomayor's opinions on the Harvard admissions case. Dead battery. On the Harvard admissions case. So let me just read you like a couple of lines. With "Let them eat cake this is Justice Jackson in her dissent. With "Let them eat cake obliviousness" today, the majority pulls the ripcord and announces colorblindness for all by legal fiat. But deeming race irrelevant in law does not make it so in life. Thank you, Graham. Justice Sotomayor. The court long ago concluded that this guarantee can be enforced through race-conscious means in a society that is not and has never been colorblind. You see the justices attacking the very notion of colorblindness. Attacking, trying to rip it to shreds, and they're going to continue to do this. This dissent is going to be the left's new war cry. And if you don't believe that critical race theory is in the schools, just read this dissent. Because this is critical race theory. Critical race theory says that America is a racist country. And as long as disparities between blacks and whites exist, it is due to racism. And you have to root out that racism in order to lower the disparity. Let me give you a couple examples. Blacks currently make up only 5% of US lawyers. That disparity, according to critical race theory, is because of racism in the law profession. It is not because of different educational outcomes. It is not because affirmative action discourages some black students from graduating the top 50% of their class, but it is due to a miasma of racism and racist institutions. That's critical race theory. Critical race theory says that the educational gap between blacks and whites in our country, and there is one, and it is large, and it's about 1 standard deviation in national test scores, K through 8, is due to racism. Where's the racism? On the part of the teacher's implicit bias, on the part of the administrator's implicit bias, on the part of the structures and institutions that create society. Well, let me tell you some of those structures and institutions that create society. We spend 3 times as much money on public education as we did over the past 40 years, which disproportionately helps blacks. We spend more money per black student in our country than we spend per white student in our country. We've done a lot of different reforms to try to reform this educational gap, and it hasn't worked. But is it because we're racist as a country? Or is it because that there are deeper seated issues within some members of this population that need to be addressed culturally and cannot be addressed by legal fiat or monetary ransom? So critical race theory is going to re-enter the law, and critical race theory is going to come at you and try to say the current way that the North Carolina legislature redistricts districts is racist because the party in power decides to draw maps to benefit the party in power. Now the problem with that argument is that, well, if the party in power, the legislature is not going to draw the maps, and who's going to draw the maps? The answer is the court system, led by judges. Even fewer people and more elite people are going to draw this court system rather than popular sovereignty. And so as long as this racism justification, this miasma of racism justification is allowed to exist in US jurisprudence and civil rights law, it's going to affect you. It's going to affect your profession. Doesn't matter what color you are, doesn't matter what law practice you're going in. Oh, you're going into property law, it's not going to affect me. Just wait. They're going to start saying that the current way the law is set up with credit scores is racist, because credit scores are racist. Oh, you're going into tort law, tax law, same things. It's going to happen, it's going to come at you, and I want you to be prepared. I want you to be prepared by reading my book, School of Woke, and I want you to be prepared by understanding how we were able to successfully fight back against their justification at the Harvard and UNC level. Finally, I want to talk about my run for Congress. I'm running for Congress because I want to enforce fairness in our society again. Whether it be the Students for Fair Admissions versus UNC and Harvard decision, there are a couple of things that I will do immediately upon my entrance in Congress. And the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to require every university to release an anonymous data set of the students' grades, SAT scores, and their race, to show whether that there have been increased or lowered standards for race. Now, your name's not going to be put in or anything like that, but we need transparency in that process, because Harvard and UNC, actually not UNC, Harvard is already trying to flout the Supreme Court versus Harvard ruling, even though the Supreme Court already said that we're going to remand your admissions process and you have to come back with a truly colorblind admissions process. They probably won't do that, so I'm there to enforce it. But I'm going to enforce fairness in other aspects of life too. This current diversity, equity, and inclusion movement that you see prop up in companies is largely due to HR compliance law. People don't really understand that or know that. But as long as the corporations continue to get entangled with government, the government's priorities are going to incentivize the company's priorities. And when the government's priorities is Build Back Better, which is Biden's agenda, it's Kamala Harris's agenda right now, and she only wants to help certain underrepresented minorities. She doesn't want to help others. She only wants to help certain underrepresented minorities. Then you're going to get a DEI regime that is racist. Racist against whites, racist against Asians, racist against any group that doesn't fit her idea of who is a privileged race and an oppression race. And then finally, I'm running for Congress to actually fix their education system. Now I get it, you guys might be skeptical. Many have tried, some have died. But the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to condition federal funding of the education system on improvement in student outcomes based on test scores. Yep, that's right, based on test scores. And the reason why is because right now our public education system has no accountability at all. The superintendent is basically appointed by the school board, comes from these woke education schools in which you're learning critical race theory and how to teach kids free Aryanism and whole word learning instead of phonics and multiplication tables. They implement their regime in these schools, scores fall, and no one gets hurt. Well, I'm going to put a little hurt in it. I'm going to put a little hurt in it because every time you ask a liberal politician about the education system, their answer is always money. Money. We just need to put more money in the education system. Well, I actually know where this money goes. After the COVID-19 pandemic, Joe Biden authorized $190 billion in federal funding in the education system in the American Rescue Plan. By the way, Donald Trump did about $20 billion, so he's not off the hook either. But he authorized $190 billion pumped into the education system, and most of it went to raises for administrators, new parking lots, and DEI. Or interventions that don't necessarily work, like lowering class sizes. So we're going to say, you want this money because it's scheduled to be up for renewal in 2025 when I get into Congress. You want this money? Show me that you're doing something with it. Show me the results of that money. So yeah, there are too many agreeable people in Congress or people who just don't know what they're doing in the education system. And I will not be that person, I can promise you that. And I was not that person at the US Supreme Court. I was not that person in the Harvard and UNC case, and I will not be that person in your congressional system. But the admonition for you guys is simply this. Whatever profession that you decide to pursue, whether it be law, activism, politics, being a consultant, you do have an opportunity to make a difference. But it will require you to, in some cases, stand against the tide. And look at the facts with a clear head and say, I don't care what the narrative is, I'm looking at the facts and I'm confident in that. And if you're not confident in the facts, you shouldn't be a lawyer. But if you are, and you can handle that criticism like we did at the US Supreme Court and Harvard's diversity justifications, on and on and on, diversity this, diversity that, then you can't do anything in this country. Thank you.